The silence in my house had a weight to it. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude. It was the dense, settled quiet of stagnation. It was the sound of dust motes dancing in sunbeams, the groan of old floorboards settling, the hum of a refrigerator that had been my most constant companion for a decade. For years, I had mistaken this inertia for contentment. I had a steady, if uninspiring, job as a town records clerk, a small house inherited from my grandparents, and a routine so ingrained it felt like a part of my own skeleton. Wake, coffee, work, dinner for one, book, sleep, repeat. A life lived in monochrome. My house, much like my life, was beginning to show its age. The pale yellow paint on the clapboard siding was peeling in long, curling strips, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath. It looked tired. It looked like I felt. Every morning, I'd step onto the porch with my mug of black coffee and see the decay, a physical manifestation of my own emotional neglect. It was a project I'd been putting off for years, always finding an excuse. Too busy, too expensive, too much work for one person. The truth was, I was just too tired. The thought of all that scraping, sanding, and painting alone felt insurmountable. It was my friend Sarah who finally pushed me. She'd stopped by with a casserole, her solution to most of life's problems, and stood on my porch, one hand on her hip, surveying the peeling paint with a critical eye. "Leo, this is just sad," she declared, her voice devoid of its usual teasing lilt. "This house has good bones. You're letting it go." She was right, of course. She was always right. Before I could formulate another excuse, she had her phone out. "I know a guy. Cole. He did my brother's deck last summer. He's meticulous, and he's not one of those contractors who vanishes for 3 weeks in the middle of a job. He's reliable." Reliable. The word itself sounded solid, dependable. It was everything my life felt it was lacking. I agreed, more out of exhaustion than enthusiasm, and a few days later, a dusty Ford pickup truck rumbled up my gravel driveway. I watched from the living room window, my heart doing a nervous little flutter I couldn't explain. A man swung out of the driver's side, and the vague, faceless Cole from Sarah's description solidified into a reality that made the air in my lungs feel suddenly thin. He wasn't what I expected. I'd pictured someone older, weathered, with a permanent squint from years in the sun. This man was maybe a few years older than me, 35 at a guess, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his simple gray t-shirt and dark, unruly hair that the wind immediately began to play with. He moved with an easy, unhurried grace, his worn leather boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the house. He stopped at the edge of the lawn, tilting his head back to look up at the peeling eaves, and the sun caught the line of his jaw, shadowed with a day's worth of stubble. I took a breath and went outside, trying to arrange my face into something resembling a competent, homeownerly expression. He turned as the screen door creaked shut behind me, and his eyes met mine. They were a startling shade of green, like moss after a rain, and they held a steady, unervingly direct gaze. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth, not a wide, flashy grin, but a small, knowing quirk that seemed to hold a hint of amusement. "Leo," he asked. His voice was lower than I'd anticipated, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate right through the porch boards. It was the kind of voice that could soothe a nervous animal or deliver a deadpan joke with equal ease. "That's me." I managed, my own voice sounding reedy and thin in comparison. "You must be Cole." "That's me," he echoed, his smile widening slightly. He extended a hand. It was large and calloused, with faint white lines of old scars crisscrossing his knuckles and a smudge of what looked like engine grease near his thumb. When his skin touched mine, a jolt of warmth shot up my arm, unexpected and potent. It was a working man's handshake, firm, brief, and confident. I felt my own hand, soft and pale from a life spent with paper and keyboards, seem utterly insignificant in his grip. He held on a fraction of a second longer than necessary, his gaze never leaving mine, before he released me. My palm tingled where he had touched it. "Sarah said you needed some help with the paint," he said, turning his attention back to the house. He walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning every board, every trim, every peeling corner. I trailed behind him like a nervous shadow, feeling oddly like I was being judged alongside my house. He'd pause occasionally, running a hand over a particularly weathered spot, his touch surprisingly gentle. "It's gotten away from me. I offered, the words feeling like a pathetic understatement. He stopped and looked at me over his shoulder, that same small smile playing on his lips. Houses do that, he said simply. They need attention. Just like anything else worth keeping, his gaze lingered on me for a beat, and I felt a strange heat creep up my neck. I couldn't decipher his expression. It wasn't pity or judgment. It was something else, something quiet and observant. Something that made me feel seen in a way that was both terrifying and thrilling. In that moment, watching this stranger assess the dilapidated skin of my home, I had the distinct and unsettling feeling that he was seeing right through the peeling paint and into the quiet, neglected rooms of me. The quiet of my house suddenly felt less like stagnation and more like a held breath. He started the next Monday. I watched from the kitchen window as he pulled up, the early morning sun glinting off the chrome of his truck's bumper. He moved with a purpose that I envied, unloading ladders, scrapers, and heavy canvas drop cloths with an economy of motion that spoke of years of practice. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. He set up a small radio on the porch railing, and the low, classic rock tunes became the soundtrack to my week. My life, once a predictable, straight line, now had a new, looping rhythm. I'd wake up, make coffee, and watch him work for a few minutes before I had to leave for my own job. I'd sit at my desk all day, stamping documents and filing deeds, but my mind would be back at my house, imagining the scrape of his tools against the wood, the low murmur of the radio, the solid presence of him just outside my walls. I started taking my lunch breaks at home, a thing I never did. I'd make a sandwich and sit at the kitchen table, pretending to read, but really I was just watching him through the window. He worked with his shirt off most days. The summer heat had settled over our small town like a thick, damp blanket, and by mid-morning, his gray t-shirt would be soaked through. He'd peel it off without a second thought and hang it on a porch post, revealing a landscape of sun-bronzed skin, lean muscle, and a fine dusting of dark hair that tapered down his stomach. I watched, mesmerized, as the muscles in his back and shoulders shifted and coiled with each long, steady scrape of his paint scraper. Sweat glistened on his skin, tracing paths down his spine. I found myself holding my breath, my sandwich forgotten in my hand, my own skin prickling with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a shameful, secret indulgence, watching him like that. I felt like a voyeur in my own home, and yet, I couldn't look away. He was a quiet worker. He didn't talk much, but the small interactions we had were charged with a strange intensity. I'd bring him out a glass of ice water, and our fingers would brush as he took it from me. A simple, accidental contact, but it felt like a static shock. He would look up from his work, his green eyes bright under the brim of his faded baseball cap, and offer that small, slow smile. "Thanks, Leo," he'd say, his voice a low rumble over the music. And for the rest of the day, I'd feel the ghost of his touch on my hand. One afternoon, I was trying to fix a wobbly porch step, a task that should have been simple but had somehow devolved into me, a hammer and a stream of frustrated muttering. Cole came around the corner of the house, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. He stopped and watched me for a moment, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Having trouble?" he asked, his tone laced with a gentle tease. I flushed, feeling foolish and inept. "It's this nail. It won't go in straight." He walked over, his boots making solid thuds on the porch. The air around him smelled of sawdust, sweat, and something else, a clean, masculine scent that was just him. He crouched down beside me, his proximity making my breath catch. His thigh was only inches from mine. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Here, let me see," he said. He took the hammer from my hand, his fingers warm against mine. "You're angling it wrong. Gotta go straight down." Like this, he positioned the nail, and with two swift, effortless taps, drove it flush with the wood. The step was solid. He stood up, handing the hammer back to me. "There you go." "Thanks," I mumbled, my gaze fixed on the now perfectly repaired step. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. The ease with which he had fixed the problem only highlighted my own incompetence. "No problem," he said. He didn't move away. I could feel his eyes on me. I finally forced myself to look up. He was watching me with that same unreadable expression, his head tilted slightly. "You think too much, Leo," he said, his voice soft. The observation was so unexpected, so accurate, that it stole the air from my lungs. "What?" "The nail," he said, tapping the step with the toe of his boot. You were thinking about where it should go, how hard to hit it, what could go wrong. Sometimes you just gotta hit the damn thing. He gave me a wink, a quick, surprising flash of boyish charm, before turning and heading back to his work, leaving me kneeling on the porch, my heart hammering against my ribs. How could he know that about me? How could this man who I barely knew see the central, paralyzing flaw of my entire existence in the simple act of my failing to hammer a nail? You think too much. The words echoed in my head. It was true. I analyzed everything. Every word, every glance, every silence. I lived in a world of hypotheticals and what-ifs. And now, my primary subject of overanalysis was the man currently sanding the trim on my bedroom window, his movements fluid and sure, utterly devoid of the hesitation that plagued me. I started dissecting his every move. The way he'd sometimes pause in his work and just stare out at the line of trees behind my property, a thoughtful, distant look on his face. The way his smile, when it reached his eyes, crinkled the skin at the corners. The way he'd hum along to a song on the radio, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. These were tiny, insignificant details, but to me, they were clues, pieces of a puzzle I was desperately trying to solve. The puzzle was Cole, and the bigger question was why I cared so much about solving it. One day, I came home from work to find him packing up. He'd finished the scraping and sanding. The house was a uniform, naked gray, waiting for its new coat of paint. He was loading his equipment into the back of his truck, his movements efficient as always. A sudden, sharp panic seized me. Was he done? Was this it? The thought of the silence returning, of my days reverting to their old, empty rhythm, was surprisingly painful. Are you leaving? I asked, the question coming out more breathless than I intended. He turned, a paint-speckled rag in his hand. He wiped his hands, his gaze steady. Just for the day? Got to pick up the paint you wanted. That misty harbor gray. And the white for the trim, he paused. I'll be back tomorrow morning. To start the priming. The relief that washed over me was so profound it made me feel lightheaded. Oh, right. Of course. He leaned against the side of his truck, crossing his arms over his chest. The posture was casual, but his eyes were focused on me, intense and searching. You seem worried, he stated. It wasn't a question. No, I thought you were finished. I stammered, feeling my cheeks grow warm. Not even close, he said, his voice low. This is the slow part. The prep work. The real change doesn't happen until the first coat goes on. He pushed off from the truck and took a step closer. You have to get rid of the old stuff before you can put on something new. It's the most important part. We stood there in the driveway as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. The air was filled with the scent of cut grass and the distant hum of cicadas. He was talking about paint, about wood, about the house. But it felt like he was talking about something else entirely. It felt like he was talking about me. The way he looked at me, with that unnerving perception, made me feel completely exposed, as if he could see all the old, peeling layers of my own life, all the parts one kept hidden away. He eventually left, his truck's red taillights disappearing down the road. I went inside, and the silence that greeted me felt different. It was no longer stagnant. It was expectant. It was the quiet before the first coat of paint, the quiet before the real change. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready. I was waiting. The next phase of the project brought a new kind of proximity. The priming and painting meant ladders against windows, tarps over my beloved rose bushes, and Cole, a constant, solid presence, moving around the exterior of my small world. The professional distance we'd maintained during the scraping phase began to erode, worn down by daily proximity and the slow, steady rhythm of the work. One sweltering afternoon, a sudden summer thunderstorm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind picked up, whipping the canvas drop cloths into frantic ghosts. I was in the kitchen when the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the window pane. I saw Cole moving quickly, securing ladders and gathering his tools. I hurried outside, the screen door slamming behind me. Let me help, I yelled over the rising wind. He glanced at me, his hair already plastered to his forehead by the rain. A corner of his mouth lifted in that familiar half-smile. Get the tarps, he shouted back. We worked together in a strange, chaotic ballet. The wind tore at the heavy canvas as we tried to fold it, turning the simple task into a wrestling match. At one point, a huge gust caught the tarp I was holding, threatening to pull me off my feet. A strong arm wrapped around my waist, steadying me. Cole was there, his body pressed against my back, his chin near my shoulder. "I got it," he murmured, his voice a low rumble right by my ear. His breath was warm against my skin. The world seemed to slow down. The rain, the wind, the flapping canvas, it all faded into a dull roar. All I could feel was the solid wall of his chest against my back, the firm grip of his hand on my hip. He smelled of rain and fresh paint. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The moment lasted only a few seconds. We wrangled the tarp into submission, and he let me go. But the imprint of his body against mine lingered, a phantom heat that the cold rain couldn't wash away. We hauled the last of his equipment onto the covered porch just as the heavens opened up completely, the rain coming down in a solid, blinding sheet. We stood side by side, breathing heavily, watching the deluge. The porch felt small, intimate. The scent of wet earth and ozone filled the air. I was acutely aware of him next to me, of the water dripping from his hair onto his shoulders, of the way his wet shirt clung to his chest. "Well," he said, breaking the silence. "That was bracing." I let out a shaky laugh. "You could say that." He turned to look at me, his green eyes dark in the stormlight. "You're soaked," he observed. "So are you." I pointed out, gesturing to his drenched clothes. "Yeah, but I'm used to it." "You look like a drowned rat." The insult was delivered with such gentle amusement that it felt like a compliment. "You should go inside and change before you catch a cold." "What about you?" I asked. "You can't drive in this." "I'll wait it out," he said, leaning against a porch post and crossing his arms. The thought of him waiting out here, cold and wet, while I was warm and dry inside felt wrong. An impulse, bold and uncharacteristic, rose in me. "No. Come in," I said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. "Come on. I'll make coffee. You can use my dryer for your shirt." He hesitated for just a moment, his eyes searching mine. I held his gaze, my heart pounding. It felt like a test. Then he nodded slowly. "Okay, Leo. Coffee sounds good." Inside, the house felt strangely quiet after the roar of the storm. I handed him a towel, my fingers brushing his as he took it. He dried his hair, the rough motion making it stand up in dark, appealing tufts. He followed my instructions and disappeared into the small laundry room off the kitchen to put his shirt in the dryer, returning a moment later bare-chested. My throat went dry. It was one thing to watch him from a distance through a window. It was another thing entirely to have him standing in my kitchen, water droplets clinging to the dark hair on his chest, his skin glowing in the warm light. I turned away quickly, focusing on the coffee maker with an intensity that was utterly ridiculous. I could feel his presence behind me, a silent, potent force. My hands trembled slightly as I measured out the coffee grounds. "Smells good," he said, his voice closer than I expected. I glanced over my shoulder. He was leaning against the counter, watching me. "It's just coffee," I said, my voice tight. "Sometimes that's all you need," he replied softly. We drank our coffee at the small kitchen table, the rain still drumming a steady rhythm on the roof. The awkwardness I'd feared didn't materialize. Instead, a comfortable silence settled between us. It was different from the empty silence I was used to. This silence was shared, filled with the quiet hum of the dryer and the clink of our mugs. He was the one who broke it. "So, town records clerk," he said, swirling the dark liquid in his mug. "Sounds quiet." I shrugged. "It is. I like quiet." It was a reflexive answer, the one I always gave. He looked at me, his gaze direct. "Do you?" The simple question disarmed me. Did I? Or had I just convinced myself I did because it was easier than admitting I was lonely? I looked down at my hands, wrapped around the warm ceramic of my mug. "I don't know," I admitted, the honesty feeling raw and strange on my tongue. "It's what I'm used to." He nodded, accepting the answer without judgment. "I get that. I was a mechanic for 10 years. Worked in a loud garage, grease up to my elbows every day. Thought that's who I was." "What changed?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I got tired of fixing things that were just going to break again," he said, a wry smile touching his lips. "Cars are temporary. A house, a deck, something made of wood. You put your work into it, you do it right, and it lasts. It becomes part of someone's home, part of their life, He looked around my small, cluttered kitchen. I like making things better, making them solid again. His words resonated with me, hitting a deep, unrecognized longing within me. To make things better, to be made solid again. We talked for another hour, the storm raging outside, while a quiet sense of connection grew between us in the warm kitchen. He told me about growing up in a town even smaller than ours, about learning carpentry from his grandfather. I found myself telling him about my grandparents, about how this house was the only real home I'd ever known. It was the most I'd talked to anyone, about anything that mattered, in years. The rain eventually subsided, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet pavement and damp earth. The dryer buzzed, signaling it was done. Cole retrieved his shirt. It was warm and soft when he pulled it on. He stood by the door, ready to leave. "Thanks for the coffee, Leo," he said. "Thanks for saving my tarp," I replied, a small smile on my face. He grinned, a full, genuine grin that transformed his face, chasing away the usual stoicism. It made my stomach do a little flip. Anytime, he lingered for a moment at the door, his hand on the knob. "I'll see you tomorrow." "Yeah," I said softly. "See you tomorrow." After he left, I stood in the middle of my kitchen for a long time. The house was silent again, but the silence had changed once more. It was filled with the echo of his voice, the memory of his laughter. The air still smelled faintly of him, of rain and coffee, and that clean, warm scent that was uniquely his. Something had shifted between us during the storm. A wall had come down. He was no longer just the handyman I was watching from my window. He was Cole, and the thought of seeing him tomorrow filled me with a feeling so bright and sharp it almost hurt. It felt a lot like hope. The work on the house progressed. The misty harbor gray went on smoothly, covering the old, naked wood, and the house began to look like itself again, only better. Fresher, more solid. My internal landscape was undergoing a similar transformation. The cautious curiosity I felt towards Cole had blossomed into a full-blown, undeniable crush. It was an adolescent, heart-thumping, stomach-flipping infatuation that I, a man in his early 30s who prided himself on his rationality, had no idea how to handle. My days became a series of small, calculated risks. I started making an extra cup of coffee in the morning and taking it out to him. I'd linger for a few minutes, making small talk about the weather or the progress on the house, my conversation skills feeling rusty and awkward. But Cole never seemed to mind. He'd lean against the ladder, sipping the coffee, and listen with that same quiet intensity, his green eyes fixed on me. He had a habit of touching me that was driving me slowly insane. It was never inappropriate, always plausible. A hand on my shoulder to steady me when I was looking at his work. His knuckles brushing mine as he passed me a tool. One time, he pointed out a spot I'd missed while watering the hydrangeas, and his hand rested on the small of my back for a few brief, electrifying seconds. Each touch was a spark on dry tinder, leaving me flustered and hyper-aware of my own body, of the space between us. I'd replay these moments in my mind for hours, analyzing them from every angle. Was he just a tactile person? Or did it mean something more? My overthinking mind, which he had so accurately identified, was in overdrive. The tipping point came on a Friday. He was finishing up the last of the trim, and the project was nearing its end. The realization landed in my stomach with a dull thud. Soon, he would be gone. The truck wouldn't be in my driveway in the morning. The low thrum of the radio would be replaced by the old, heavy silence. The thought was unbearable. He'd mentioned needing a specific type of wood sealant that our local hardware store didn't carry. The closest place that had it was a specialty lumber yard in a town about an hour away. Acting on another one of those rare, reckless impulses, I heard myself speaking before I could stop the words. "I could drive you," I said, as he was wiping his hands on a rag, preparing to leave for the day. "I have to, run an errand in that direction anyway." It was a blatant lie. The only errand I had was my weekly trip to the grocery store. He paused, turning to look at me. He had a smudge of white paint on his cheekbone. I had the absurd urge to wipe it off. He studied my face for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. I was sure he could see right through my flimsy excuse. I prepared for a polite refusal. "Yeah," he said finally. "Okay, that'd be great, actually. Save me some gas," he smiled, and the relief was so acute I felt my knees go weak. "I'll buy you dinner to say thanks." So, The next afternoon, I found myself in the passenger seat of my own car, with Cole driving. It felt strange, surrendering control like that. He drove like he did everything else, with a calm, steady confidence. He rested one arm on the open window, the wind ruffling his hair. He'd brought his own music, a collection of old folk and blues artists I'd never heard of, and the soulful, melancholic melodies filled the car, a perfect soundtrack for the rolling hills and green farmland we passed. The hour-long drive was the most relaxed I'd felt in his presence. There was no pretense, no project to discuss. We just talked. He asked me about my job, not with the polite disinterest most people showed, but with genuine curiosity. He wanted to know about the old maps I sometimes had to handle, the strange property disputes recorded in 100-year-old ledgers. He made my quiet, dusty job sound interesting. In turn, I learned that he'd built the furniture in his own small apartment, that he was trying to save up to buy a small plot of land and build his own house one day. A place with a big porch, he'd said, looking out at the passing scenery. We found the lumber yard, bought the sealant, and on the way back, he directed me to a small, roadside diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1960s. Inside, the booths were cracked red vinyl, and the air smelled of fried onions and coffee. We ate burgers and fries, and he teased me for putting ketchup on my hot dog. It was easy. It was comfortable. It felt dangerously like a date. As we sat there, laughing over something stupid, I allowed myself, for just a moment, to imagine this being my life. Easy laughter, shared meals, the comfortable presence of this man beside me. The longing was a sharp ache in my chest. It was dark by the time we got back on the road. The landscape was swallowed by the night. Our world shrunk to the twin beams of the headlights cutting through the blackness. The bluesy music played softly on the stereo. Cole was quiet, his face illuminated intermittently by the dashboard lights. The comfortable ease of dinner had been replaced by a different kind of energy, a humming tension that seemed to grow with every mile we traveled. We were about 10 minutes from my house, on a long, dark stretch of country road, when the world exploded in red and blue light. My heart leaped into my throat. Flashing lights filled the rearview mirror, painting the inside of the car in strobing, frantic colors. "What the hell?" Cole muttered, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He slowed the car and pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel approaching the driver's side window. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on Cole's face, then sweeping over to me, blinding me for a second. I recognized the silhouette of the man holding it. Deputy Miller, a man known in our town for two things: a rigid adherence to the letter of the law and a thinly veiled contempt for anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of the world. I'd had a run-in with him once, years ago, and the memory of his sneering dislike still made my stomach clench. "Evening, Cole," Miller said, his voice dripping with a false, folksy charm. "License and registration." Cole passed the documents out the window without a word. Miller took his time examining them, his flashlight beam lingering on Cole's face. "You were weaving a bit back there, son. You been drinking tonight?" "No, sir," Cole said, his voice perfectly level. "Just had dinner at the diner over in Westfield." Miller's gaze shifted to me again. His eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "Leo," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Leo," Miller repeated, drawing the name out. He knew who I was. Everyone in a town this size knew everyone. He knew I lived alone, that I kept to myself. His flashlight beam lingered on my face, then dropped to my hand, which was resting nervously on my knee. "Bit late for you two to be out for a joyride, isn't it?" The insinuation in his tone was unmistakable. It was thick and ugly. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. This wasn't a random traffic stop. This was a targeted harassment. My quiet life, my carefully constructed invisibility, was about to be shattered on a dark country road. My mind went blank with panic. Cole, however, seemed preternaturally calm. He didn't rise to the bait. He just looked at Miller, his expression unreadable in the strobing lights. Then he did something that completely unmoored me from reality. He turned to me, and in the colored chaos of the flashing lights, his face was a mask of theatrical frustration. "I told you we should have just stayed home," he said, his voice loud enough for Miller to hear. It was sharp, laced with an annoyance that sounded utterly convincing. "But no, You had to have that damn pie. I stared at him, my brain struggling to catch up. What was he doing? He turned back to the deputy. Sorry, officer. We're having a bit of a lover's quarrel, he sighed. A performance of pure, put-upon exasperation. He gets dramatic. Miller was taken aback, his smug expression faltering for a second. This was not the reaction he had expected. And then Cole went further. He unbuckled his seatbelt. You know what? I can't do this right now. He opened the car door. Get out, Leo. What? The word was a choked squeak. Out, he commanded, his voice hard. My body moved on autopilot, my limbs clumsy with confusion and fear. I fumbled with the door handle and stumbled out onto the gravel shoulder. The air was cool against my flushed skin. Cole got out and slammed his door shut. He stalked around the back of the car, his movements angry and purposeful. Miller watched, his flashlight beam following Cole, a confused, suspicious look on his face. Cole came to a stop in front of me. He was silhouetted against the headlights, a tall, dark figure of feigned fury. Put your hands on the hood, he growled, his voice low and guttural. My mind was screaming. This is insane. What is he doing? But my body, conditioned to obey, responded. I turned and placed my trembling hands on the cool metal hood of my car. I braced myself. For what? I didn't know. An angry word? A shove? Instead, his body pressed against my back. It was a shock, a sudden, solid wall of heat from my shoulders to my thighs. It was the same feeling from the porch during the storm, but 1,000 times more intense. One of his hands landed firmly on the small of my back, holding me in place. The other came up to cup the back of my head, his fingers tangling in my hair. His breath was hot against my ear. Just play along, he whispered, his voice a ghost of sound meant only for me. Trust me. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a kiss. It was a claiming. His lips didn't touch mine. He pressed his mouth to the side of my neck, just below my ear, his stubble a rough, exquisite abrasion against my skin. It was a possessive, almost aggressive act, meant entirely for the audience of one standing a few feet away. But for me, trapped between the cold metal of the car and the burning heat of his body, it was the most intimate thing I had ever experienced. A shudder racked my frame. My knees felt weak. My hands gripped the hood of the car to keep from collapsing. I could feel the low, steady thrum of his heartbeat against my back, or maybe it was my own. He held the position for a few long, agonizingly sweet seconds. Then he lifted his head. He didn't move away. He just rested his forehead against the back of my head, his hands still tangled in my hair. His breathing was a little unsteady. Now are you going to apologize for being a pain in my ass all night? He said, his voice still carrying that sharp, annoyed edge for Miller's benefit, but it was rougher now, strained. From behind us, I heard Miller clear his throat. The sound was loud in the charged silence. All right, he said, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. He sounded flustered, uncomfortable. This display of overt, unapologetic intimacy was more than he'd bargained for. It wasn't the furtive, shameful secret he'd been hoping to expose. It was something bold and confrontational. Just watch your speed. And take your argument home. I heard his boots crunch on the gravel as he retreated. A car door slammed. A moment later, his cruiser pulled away, the red and blue lights painting a retreating path down the dark road until they were swallowed by the night. And then there was only silence. The deep, profound silence of the country at night, punctuated by the frantic drumming of my own heart. Cole didn't move. He was still pressed against me, his hand in my hair, his forehead resting against mine. The anger, the performance, it had all evaporated, leaving behind something raw and real. I could feel the tension in his body, the tight coil of muscle in his arm. He was breathing slowly, deliberately, as if trying to calm himself. The air was thick with unspoken things. The ghost of his lips burned on my neck. My entire body was a live wire, humming with a mixture of terror and a wild, exhilarating thrill. The pretense had been stripped away. He had, in the most public and terrifying way possible, laid a claim. He had called us lovers. He had kissed me. It was all a show, a brilliant, audacious piece of theater to get us out of a dangerous situation. I knew that. My rational mind knew that. But my body didn't. My heart didn't. He finally took a slow breath and stepped back. The sudden loss of his warmth was like a physical blow. I felt cold and exposed. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I kept my hands on the hood, my gaze fixed on my own pale, blurry reflection in the dark paint. I waited. I heard him move, his boots scuffing the gravel. He came to stand beside me, close enough that our arms were almost touching, but not quite. He leaned his hip against the car, mirroring my posture. He stared out into the darkness in front of us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. I replayed the last 5 minutes over and over in my head. The flashing lights, Miller's sneer, Cole's voice, lover's quarrel, the heat of his body, his lips on my skin. Trust me. You okay? He asked finally, his voice quiet. The forced anger was gone, replaced by a low, rough timbre that was full of concern. I couldn't find my voice. I just nodded, a jerky, unconvincing movement. Leo, he said my name, and it was a plea. Look at me. Slowly, I lifted my head and turned to face him. In the faint starlight, his face was all shadows and angles. His green eyes were dark, searching mine. He looked uncertain. It was the first time I had ever seen him look anything less than completely in control. The sight of that vulnerability in him gave me a sliver of courage. I started, my voice hoarse. That was a performance. I said it as a statement, a way to ground myself in reality. It was a lie. I needed him to tell me it was a lie, or I needed him to tell me it wasn't. I wasn't sure which. He held my gaze. He didn't deny it, didn't immediately reassure me that it was all an act. He just watched my face, his own expression taut. Miller's a bastard, he said, his voice tight with a remnant of real anger. He was looking for trouble. I saw the way he was looking at you. I had to do something to throw him off, to make him back down. So it was a performance. I repeated, and this time, the words tasted like ash in my mouth. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, lanced through me. Of course it was. What else could it be? He took a step closer, closing the small space between us. He reached out, not with the confident surety he usually had, but with a slight hesitation, and his thumb came up to gently brush against the spot on my neck where his mouth had been. My skin leaped at his touch. I flinched, not away from him, but just a small, involuntary shudder. His eyes tracked the movement. Was it? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't move his hand. His thumb rested on my pulse point, and I was sure he could feel the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of my heart. The part where I wanted to shut him up? The part where I wanted to get him to leave you alone? Yeah, that was a performance. A necessary 1 inch. He paused, his gaze dropping to my lips, then rising to meet my eyes again. The air crackled. The world seemed to hold its breath. This part, he murmured, his voice going rough, is not. He leaned in, slowly this time. There was no pretense, no audience. Just us, on a dark road, surrounded by the quiet of the night. He gave me every opportunity to pull away, to turn my head, to say no. I did none of those things. I stood frozen, my heart roaring in my ears, and watched him come closer. His lips touched mine. It was nothing like the desperate, theatrical press of his mouth against my neck. This was soft. It was tentative, a question. His lips were warm and gentle. He wasn't demanding anything. He was offering. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, and my own lips parted slightly. That was all the encouragement he needed. He deepened the kiss, and it was like a dam breaking inside me. All the weeks of watching him, of yearning for him, of analyzing every small touch and quiet glance, it all came rushing out in a wave of overwhelming sensation. I brought my hands up from the hood of the car and rested them on his chest. I could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart under my palm. It was just as fast as my own. He made a low sound in the back of his throat and his arms came around me, one hand splayed against the small of my back, the other cradling my head, his fingers tangling in my hair just as they had before. But this time it wasn't a restraint, it was an anchor. He pulled me flush against him, and I melted into his embrace, into the kiss. It was not a rushed, frantic kiss. It was deep and slow and honest. It tasted of coffee and the faint, lingering sweetness of the diner pie we'd shared. It felt like a discovery, like we were learning the shape and texture of each other for the first time. It felt like coming home. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He didn't let me go. He rested his forehead against mine, our breaths mingling in the cool night air. I kept my eyes closed, trying to commit every sensation to memory. The rough texture of his stubble against my skin, the solid feel of his chest beneath my hands, the scent of him, clean and male and intoxicating. Leo, he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. I opened my eyes. His were only inches from mine, dark and intense. Cole, I whispered back. There was nothing else to say. My name on his lips, his on mine. It was enough. He pressed one more soft, lingering kiss to my lips before he finally, reluctantly, stepped back. We should go, he said, though he made no move toward the car door. Before Miller decides to circle back. I nodded, my legs still feeling unsteady. We got back in the car. The silence that filled the small space now was entirely different. It was no longer tense or awkward. It was full. It was charged with the kinetic energy of what had just happened, with the promise of what was to come. When Cole reached over and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine and resting our joined hands on the center console, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. His hand was warm and calloused and strong around mine. It felt right. The rest of the drive to my house passed in a blur. When he pulled into my driveway and cut the engine, the familiar sight of my freshly painted house in the moonlight looked different. It looked like a beginning. He turned to me, his face serious in the dim light. I'm not sorry, he said, his voice low and firm. About any of it. Me neither, I said, and the truth of the words settled deep in my bones. I wasn't sorry. I was terrified and exhilarated, and more alive than I had felt in my entire life. He brought my hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. The house is almost finished, he said, his eyes holding mine. My heart sank. The project, the reason for him being here, it was almost over. The fear that this, too, was temporary, that it was a product of proximity and a high-stress situation, crept in. As if reading my mind, he tightened his grip on my hand. But I don't think we are, he added softly. Are we? I looked at him, at the genuine question in his eyes, the hint of vulnerability there. This confident, capable man was asking me for reassurance. And in that moment, all my fear, all my chronic overthinking, it all just fell away. I was left with a simple, shining truth. No, I said, my voice clear and steady. We're not even close. A slow smile spread across his face. It was the best one yet. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, and it was full of warmth and relief and a promise that made my heart soar. He leaned across the console and kissed me again, a sweet, definite kiss that sealed the promise in the quiet of my driveway. The silence of my life had finally been broken, not by noise, but by a connection so profound it felt like its own beautiful sound. He stayed. There was no discussion, no formal invitation asked for or given. It was an unspoken assumption, a natural continuation of the kiss in my driveway. He followed me inside, his presence filling the small house in a way that felt not like an intrusion, but a completion. The familiar rooms, once spaces of solitude, were suddenly charged with a new energy. He kicked off his boots by the door, a simple, domestic act that sent a tremor of something warm and hopeful through me. We didn't talk much at first. Words felt clumsy and inadequate after the raw honesty of what had passed between us on that dark road. Instead, we moved around each other in a slow, quiet dance of discovery. I made tea, my hands moving with a steadiness that surprised me. He stood leaning against the kitchen counter, just as he had during the storm, but this time there was no barrier of uncertainty between us. He just watched me, his gaze warm and appreciative. When the tea was ready, I turned to hand him a mug, and he was there, closer than I'd expected. He took the mug from me, his fingers brushing mine, and set it on the counter. Then he framed my face with his large, warm hands, his thumbs gently stroking my cheekbones. I've wanted to do that for weeks, he confessed, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through my chest. Kiss you. Weeks, I whispered, my breath catching. He nodded, a small, wry smile on his lips. From the first day? When you came out on the porch looking so serious and trying so hard to be the responsible homeowner, he chuckled softly. You had this little frown line between your eyebrows. I wanted to smooth it out. His thumb brushed over that exact spot, and my eyes fluttered shut. I've been watching you watch me through that window, he added, his voice dropping even lower. A hot flush spread from my neck to my face. You knew? I knew, he confirmed. I was hoping. All that time I'd spent in agonized analysis, dissecting his every glance, trying to decipher his intentions. He had been doing the same. We had been two people on opposite sides of a pane of glass, both looking in, both waiting. The thought was dizzying. He kissed me then, and it was different again. It was slow and deep, full of all the things we hadn't said. It was a kiss that spoke of weeks of pent-up longing, of shared glances and accidental touches. It was a confirmation and a celebration. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, and for the first time, I wasn't thinking. I was just feeling. The solid strength of him, the soft pressure of his lips, the clean scent of his skin. It was overwhelming, and it was perfect. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. For a confused moment, I thought I was dreaming. Then I opened my eyes. Sunlight was streaming through my bedroom window, illuminating the dust motes I knew so well. But the room felt different. I wasn't alone. I turned my head, and Cole was sitting in the old armchair in the corner, a mug in his hand, watching me. He was wearing his jeans from the night before, but he was shirtless, and the morning light sculpted the lean muscles of his chest and arms. A wave of anxiety, cold and sharp, washed over me. The morning after, the harsh light of day. This was the part where regrets were formed, where the magic of the night before dissolved into awkwardness. I braced myself for it. He must have seen the fear in my eyes, because his expression softened. He stood up and walked over to the bed, sitting on the edge. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of my hair behind my ear, his touch gentle. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning," I replied, my voice husky with sleep. "I made coffee," he said, gesturing with his head toward the door. "Wasn't sure how you took it, so I just made it black." "Black is good," I said, my mind racing. "Say something. Don't just lie here like an idiot." He just kept looking at me, his green eyes clear and steady. He wasn't awkward. He wasn't distant. He was just there, present. And then he smiled, that slow, easy smile that made my stomach flutter. "You're thinking again," he said, his voice laced with affection. I can practically hear the gears turning. I let out a shaky breath, half laugh, half sigh of relief. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to me," he said. He leaned in and pressed a soft, chaste kiss to my forehead. "Stop thinking. There's nothing to figure out right now. There's just this." He took my hand, his thumb stroking over my knuckles. Okay. I repeated, the word feeling like an exhale. He was right. There was just this quiet room, the smell of coffee, the warmth of his hand in mine. It was simple. It was real. The last few days of the project were transformed. He was no longer just the handyman. He was Cole, and I was his. The work itself became a shared act of creation. I helped him with the final coat on the porch railings, my movements clumsy next to his practiced ease. But he was patient, correcting my technique with a hand over mine, his body pressed close behind me. We worked in a comfortable silence, punctuated by easy conversation and stolen kisses behind the ladder. The house, which had for so long been a symbol of my stagnation, was now the backdrop to our beginning, every fresh coat of paint a new memory. But as the last of the work was completed, a new, more subtle anxiety began to creep in. The catalyst for our meeting was gone. The house was finished. It looked beautiful, solid, and new. But what now? He didn't live here. He had his own apartment, his own life. The bubble we had created around my small property felt fragile, threatened by the reality of the outside world. The rumor mill in a town our size is swift and merciless. I had no doubt that Deputy Miller, smarting from his humiliation, had already shared his version of events. I started to notice the looks when I went to the grocery store, the sudden silences when I walked past a group of people, the whispers. It was exactly what I had spent my entire adult life trying to avoid. The old me would have retreated, pulled the walls up, and hidden inside my newly painted house until it all blew over. But the old me hadn't been kissed senseless by a man who looked at him like he was the only person in the world. One evening, we were sitting on the newly painted porch swing, a project Cole had insisted on adding as a finishing touch. We were watching the fireflies begin to blink in the twilight, a comfortable silence between us. "People are talking," I said quietly, breaking the spell. Cole didn't pretend not to know what I meant. He continued to push the swing gently with his foot, the chains creaking in a slow, rhythmic lullaby. "Let him," he said simply. "It doesn't bother you?" I asked, looking at his profile in the fading light. He turned to look at me, his expression serious. The only thing that bothers me is the thought of you being scared. Or ashamed. He reached over and took my hand. Are you? I thought about it. I thought about the whispers, the stares. I thought about the life of careful invisibility I had cultivated. And then I thought about waking up next to him, about the easy laughter we shared, about the solid, grounding feel of his hand in mine. The fear was there, a faint, familiar echo. But it was overshadowed by something much stronger. No, I said, and I was surprised by the conviction in my own voice. I'm not ashamed. I'm just new to this. To us. He squeezed my hand. Me too, he admitted. But I'm a fast learner. He gave me that roguish wink that always made my heart skip a beat. A few days later, he packed the last of his tools into his truck. The job was officially, completely done. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. This was it. The moment of truth. He would drive away, back to his life, and I would be left here in mine. We hadn't talked about the future, not really. We had lived in a blissful, suspended present. He closed the tailgate of his truck with a decisive thud and walked toward me where I stood on the porch, trying to keep my expression neutral. He stopped in front of me, his hands in his pockets. Well, he said, looking up at the house. She's all done. It looks amazing, Cole, I said, my voice thick. Thank you. You're welcome. He looked at me, his gaze intense. So I guess I should get paid. Oh, right, of course, I said, flustered. I'd written him a check that morning, the final payment for the job. It felt so transactional, so final. I pulled it from my pocket and handed it to him. He took it, but he didn't look at it. He just held it in his hand, his eyes never leaving mine. There's one more thing, he said. My heart hammered against my ribs. What? He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a single, newly cut key. It shone, brassy and bright, in the afternoon sun. He held it out to me on his open palm. I stared at it, confused. What's this? It's a key, he said, a small smile playing on his lips. To my apartment. I looked from the key back to his face, my mind struggling to process his meaning. The thing is, he continued, his voice softer now, I'm getting kind of tired of driving back and forth. And my place is small, and it doesn't have a porch swing. He took a step closer, his smile widening. And more importantly, you're not there. He gently closed my fingers around the warm metal of the key. So I was thinking, maybe I don't go back there tonight. Or any other night. Maybe I stay here. If you'll have me. Tears pricked my eyes. It wasn't a grand, poetic declaration. It was simple and practical, and so perfectly Cole. He wasn't asking for forever. He was asking for tonight. And all the tonights after. He was asking to build something new with me, now that the prep work was done. I couldn't speak. I just launched myself at him, wrapping my arms around his neck and kissing him with all the relief and joy and love that was swelling in my chest. He laughed against my lips, his strong arms circling my waist and lifting me off my feet. He spun me around once on the porch of the house he had rebuilt, our house now, and it wasn't an ending. It was the first coat of paint on a whole new life. Later, as the sun went down, we sat on the porch swing again, his arm around my shoulders, my head resting against his chest. I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear, a comforting, solid drumbeat that had become my new favorite sound. The house stood before us, bathed in the soft, golden light of dusk. It was no longer just a structure of wood and nails. It was a testament. It was proof that things that are old and neglected can be made new again. That you have to scrape away the old, peeling layers to let in the light. I thought about the man I was just a few weeks ago, living a half-life in the gray, silent rooms of this house. I had been so convinced that my quiet life was a choice, a preference. But it had just been a long, lonely waiting period. I'd been waiting for him, and I hadn't even known it. I'd been waiting for someone to see the good bones underneath the peeling paint. Someone to have the patience for the slow, hard work of restoration. Cole pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his lips moving against my hair. What are you thinking about? He murmured. I smiled, tilting my head back to look at him. His face was relaxed, content. The setting sun lit up his green eyes, making them glow. Just everything, I said. And how you were right. I'm right about a lot of things, he teased. You'll have to be more specific. You said sometimes you just have to hit the damn nail, I reminded him. Stop thinking so much. His expression softened with understanding. He tightened his arm around me, pulling me closer. And I looked out at the evening sky, at the first stars beginning to appear. The silence of the night was settling in, but it wasn't the heavy, stagnant silence of my past. It was a peaceful, shared quiet. It was the sound of contentment. And I said, my voice full of a certainty that felt brand new, I'm finally learning how it felt like I'd come home. Not just to the house, but to myself. And I knew, with a bone-deep conviction, that this was just the beginning. The real change was just starting.